start with a big piece of paper. Now, what I've got here is just some 1-inch graph paper. You can get this at Staples. It's like 10 bucks for a big pad of it, and I really think it's worth it if you're going to be drafting a lot of patterns. But you know, any big piece of paper will work. You can use newspaper, you can use wrapping paper, you can use brown paper. It doesn't really matter, but you're going to start by folding it in half. Sorry, folding it in half lengthwise. And then I'm just going to do an arbitrary line here, which I'm going to do all my measurements from. Then I'm going to need to take my waist measurement and divide that by 2, and then measure that out on here. And just draw another line. Okay, so this represents half of my waist measurement. I'm then going to divide this again in half and draw a line here to mark it off. And then from this line, I want to do about, front and the back, it's going to be like 3-4 inches. So obviously this is folded in half, so you do like half of that. So do like 2 inches maybe. Okay, and then you got to think about how high you want it to come up in the front. You probably want between maybe 8 and 12 inches. I'm going to go with 10. Okay, so you've basically got this here, and then you just want to like curve it nicely so that what you actually have is shaped kind of like this, and then you want to cut it out. And voila, that is your pattern. You're going to cut it out on the fabric. This will be on the fold, obviously. Don't worry about the measurements being exact. You actually want this a bit smaller than your waist. So yeah, this is your pattern. Go cut it out. So I've cut my fabric out, and I've actually cut it out twice. Now you could use the same fabric or different fabric. It doesn't really matter. If you use different fabric, then what you'd have would be basically a reversible corset where you could have like 2 different fabrics, because it is essentially exactly the same on the inside as it is on the outside. So I've cut out 2 of these in my fabric, and I've also cut out 2 of them in interfacing. Now this is light to medium weight fusible interfacing. Now most of the time with corsets you want to just get the heaviest interfacing you can find, but with this one it's kind of a pseudo corset, so you just want something pretty lightweight. Like this is fine. You don't want it to be very stiff, you just want it to hold its shape. So yeah, I've cut out 2 in fabric, 2 in interfacing, and then I'm going to iron on the interfacing before I continue. Once the interfacing has been ironed on, you just want to put them right sides together. And then you're going to sew along here, and you're going to sew along here to basically make like a tube, almost. So can you see where I've stitched it? Now you just need to turn this right side out. And then you should iron this. You can also top stitch, that's optional, but at the very least you need to iron. Okay, so I've top stitched. It's not really too obvious, but it will kind of just hold everything in place so that nothing shifts when you're wearing it. Yeah. Okay, now comes probably the hardest part, which is putting the boning in. Now, boning in this corset is sort of optional. I don't recommend going without it, but you can. If you really have to. Now boning, there are basically 2 types of boning. There's plastic whalebone, and then there's Rigaline boning. Now this is the plastic kind. It's kind of like a molded plastic. It's really soft, but it does hold its shape really, really well. It usually comes in like a fabric casing. The other kind is kind of like you know, fishing wire or fishing line. It's kind of like that, but it's woven, and it gives like the same amount of stiffness, but if you're pulling something tight, it usually ends up buckling, and like, yeah. I tend to avoid that kind. I buy this kind. Now you can buy this with or without the casing. It's kind of hard to find in fabric stores without the casing. but you can get it online, because a lot of projects I just end up taking the casing off. And I mean, like, the difference in price between this just plastic stuff is maybe like 15 cents a meter versus like $3 or $4 a meter once you've got the casing on. So, but you might have to order it online though. You can't always find it in fabric stores. So anyway, sewing the boning in. I am going to utilize the casing today. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to sew this whole thing along as close to the edge as I can. Now I've switched to a zipper foot just because the boning's in the casing, like, yeah. Oh, also at this point you've got to decide what's the right side and what's the wrong side. It's really not that important, but if you see, like me, it didn't end up being exactly symmetrical, I'm going to sew it on this side so that when I fold it over it doesn't matter. And you don't want to sew onto the plastic, you just want to sew the casing. So I'm just going to sew this on. Okay, so I've just stitched the boning on both sides of the casing, and now what you need to do is just roll it over and then stitch it again. Now you can roll it over once or you can roll it over twice. It really depends on the finish that you want. I'm just going to go with once because I did not leave enough of a seam allowance to do it twice, but yeah, it really depends on what you want it to look like in the end. And I'm just going to stitch along here to hold it in place. Something to keep in mind is boning has a natural curve to it. So when you roll it over, you always want it to, the finished thing to roll in towards your stomach so that it doesn't curl out while you're wearing it. So I'm just going to roll this over and then sew it. So I've sewn the boning into both sides and then rolled it over and then sewn it again. And I also went back and added a zigzag stitch just because this seam allowance was so small and so frayed already. I was afraid it was going to come undone, but that was my own fault for not leaving enough of a seam allowance. You don't have to zigzag it. I mean, you can if you want, but this was just how I compensated for not leaving enough seam allowance. So I think it's in there pretty secure now though. So the last step is to just add your eyelets. So what I'm going to do is line this up, the two sides, pretty evenly, and then you can take your tailor's chalk and start marking off where you want the eyelets to be. I can't find my ruler, so what I'm going to do is just, you know, take whatever to act as a guide so that they're an even distance apart. So then you just need to snip a tiny hole through both layers of the fabric wherever you want the eyelet to be. Okay, so just take your eyelet and put it through one of the holes. And then use your eyelet tool to crimp the end down. Now there's two kinds of eyelet tools. There's this kind which you need to hammer, and then there's this kind which you just put it in and press. It's up to you which one you use. This tends to be a bit quicker, but I think using the hammer looks nicer. And once all the eyelets are in, the only thing left to do is put it on and lace it up.